All right, hi everyone. I hope you're having a good day. So, if you look at the syllabus for this week, there are actually two topics to cover. If you're going through as the kind of suggested each week you watch this video, do this activity. Of course, you can move at your own pace through the class. If you want to work ahead, you can do that as well. But if you're following that, what are we doing this week? There's actually two topics. There's chapter 6, which is related to disorders of stress and trauma. And then there's part of chapter 7. So in this particular video that you're watching right now, we're going to talk about issues related to stress and trauma. There will also be another video that will be posted for you that will discuss the first half of chapter 7. So chapter 7 is on mood disorders, and the way that I've split it up is that the first lecture on mood disorders is going to talk specifically about unipolar depression, versus the second part, which is going to be in a different video, that's going to talk about bipolar disorder, which would include bipolar depression. So when you're preparing for exam 2, I've split chapter 7 so that the lecture on unipolar depression, which is depression without mania, that lecture is going to be on exam 2. After exam 2, then we'll pick up with the second half of chapter 7, where we'll talk about bipolar disorders. So in this video, we're going to talk about disorders that are related to stress and trauma, but there will also, for this week, according to the schedule and the syllabus, be a video on depressive disorders as well. In this video, we will talk about the topic for activity 6. Remember that I am looking for your original work, and I'm looking for a response that is at least 200 words long. So let me know if you have any questions. Let's go ahead and get into lecture.
Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be talking about disorders of trauma and stress. Now, before we can talk about stress disorders, first we have to define stress. And I can imagine that most of you watching this lecture video are thinking, yeah, I'm a college student. I know what it means to be stressed. Stress is made up of two components: the actual event itself that's causing the stress, the stressor, and then also the stress response. Now, both of these are important in your experience of stress. So first you have this event that creates demands. Now it could be that something is demanding your time. It could be something is demanding your money. Something is demanding your energy. Whatever the case may be, there's something that's putting a demand on you. And it may feel like there are several different events going on at one time that are putting demands on you. The stress response refers to how you react to those demands. So you've probably seen different people respond to stress differently, and we understand that there may be some ways that are a little bit healthier, a little bit better for us psychologically when it comes to responding to stress, right? So if you have a stressful situation, your response will dictate how you feel in that moment. So if you immediately start telling yourself, okay, this is too much, I can't handle it, you start getting overwhelmed, then you're much more likely to feel stressed for a longer period of time. So the idea here is that, this is kind of a cognitive perspective, that everyone has stressors placed on them, but the way you respond to that stress, the way you think about those events, will greatly impact your outcomes. So people who have a sense that they have the ability and resources to cope are more likely to take stressors in stride and respond well. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, that's well and good, but I don't have complete control over my resources, and I understand that. Maybe you're in a time period of your life where you really don't have the financial resources, or you really don't have the energy resources. I understand that. But there may be some things you can do to help make sure you have enough resources to handle stress. So this is where I tell students to make sure that you're engaging in some self-care. Make sure that you're sleeping, make sure that you're eating, make sure that you're surrounding yourself with good relationships, because there are some ways that you can build up your resources to help you respond better to stress. So there's both the event that causes the stress as well as your response, and then those two things are going to dictate your outcomes. Now, today we're going to be talking about acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. These previously were conceptualized as anxiety disorders. So, based on previous versions of the DSM, this information might have been in our last lecture video. In the DSM-5, they're conceptualized a little bit differently as being trauma and stress related disorders. Now, This does not mean that they don't involve anxiety. They do. A lot of the core symptoms of acute stress disorder and PTSD are going to look similar to some of the symptoms of anxiety disorders. I believe the reason that they have kind of moved them to their own section, though, is the difference in the origin of the disorder. So, whereas a stressful life event could potentially trigger OCD or trigger generalized anxiety disorder, a stressful life situation is required for one of these diagnoses: acute stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so oftentimes we would say that the origin of the disorder is pretty much has to be environmental. And then there are some internal things, some biological things that impact how you respond to that environmental incident. But there has to be some kind of a trigger here or an event that led to these symptoms. So these are going to be considered trauma and stressor related disorders. Now, you will also find, since we're talking about stress, you will also find in the DSM what they call psychophysiological disorders. Basically, in that particular section, they're looking at how maybe you have a medical condition, but the stress that you're under, the psychological stress, impacts your medical condition. So this would be something that maybe the person already had, for example, a heart condition, but because of stress or because of anxiety, their heart condition gets worse. We know that prolonged exposure to stress can increase your blood pressure and can cause some negative effects on your health. It is also possible that the stress kind of causes the medical problem. Maybe the medical problem wasn't there before, but the stress created a medical problem. So definitely there is a relationship between your physical health and your psychological health. That's really all I'm going to say about that at this point, but we will have a lecture coming up where we talk about disorders that overlap a little bit more. But today we're going to be talking more about specifically stress disorders. Now, it's important to understand what stress does to you so that you can understand the symptoms that are associated with the disorders we're going to talk about today. So, arousal and fear are primarily going to activate two aspects of your body. The endocrine system is basically, it's in charge of your hormones. And so there are certain hormones that are going to be released in greater amounts, things like cortisol and others, that are increased when you are stressed out. So prolonged exposure to stress can greatly impact a person's hormones. And because of that, in addition to several other things, it can impact a person's fertility, it can impact puberty. So one thing we see is that individuals, especially girls, who have grown up in stressful, maybe dangerous environments, are more likely to start menstruating earlier, at earlier ages. It's like your body says, okay, you have to grow up now, you have to be an adult. So prolonged exposure to stress can greatly impact your hormones. But a lot of the symptoms we're going to be talking about are going to be related to the autonomic nervous system. Now, you'll see a picture of this, I think on the next slide, that'll give some details here. Your autonomic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system. It's basically a connection from the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord. We're talking about the connections from your brain and your spinal cord to the rest of your body, to all of the other organs in your body. So those nerve connections. Now, what we're going to be seeing is that a person who is exposed to prolonged stress can have symptoms in basically every part of their body, all over their bodies. And that what they're going to be experiencing is something that most people do feel on occasion, but it's very different when you feel it all day, every day. So basically we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system here, or your fight or flight system. So the autonomic nervous system is made up of two parts, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. They work in harmony with each other, and they are both really required for a person. Your sympathetic nervous system kicks in when you need to take action. So this is your fight or flight system. So if you're in a dangerous situation, right? If you're about to stand up and give a speech, perhaps, which can feel like a dangerous situation, I know. One of those things where your body is preparing itself to either run away or to fight if necessary. So your sympathetic nervous system happens when your body is prepared to deal with a threat. On the other hand, your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in when your body is ready to calm down. So when I think about the parasympathetic nervous system, I think about laying on the couch watching football after eating too much food at Thanksgiving. So your parasympathetic nervous system is your resting and digesting nervous system. Now you need them both. If, for example, a person always had this parasympathetic nervous system activity, then they might not be able to respond appropriately to danger, because if a dangerous situation arises and your body's not prepared to deal with it, you could be harmed. On the other hand, think about a person whose sympathetic nervous system is overactive, so a person who is always in that fight or flight state of arousal. That's going to be exhausting. It's going to exhaust the person physically, and it's going to be also not good for them psychologically. So what we're going to see is that individuals who have stress disorders often have overactive sympathetic nervous system. So your body's fight or flight, which is supposed to kick in, get you through a dangerous situation, and then back off, it never really backs off. So what does this feel like? Sympathetic nervous system. This is your body's fight or flight preparing you to deal with danger. So first of all, it dilates your pupil. Why does that matter? Well, if you think about the way that the eye works, having your pupils dilated lets in more light. And so potentially that would help you be able to see better. It inhibits salivation. So what you're going to see is that when you're in a dangerous situation, your body has to divert its resources to where they're needed. So digestion is all of a sudden not considered a high priority right now. We need to run away. So you need your blood going to your muscles, not necessarily to your digestive system. So it's going to inhibit salivation. It's going to inhibit digestive activity. It's going to relax your bronchi so you can breathe better, accelerate your heart rate, stimulate the release of glucose, so sugar, that's energy, right? It's going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, that's adrenaline, right, to help you get going. It relaxes your bladder, which is why sometimes when people are scared, they urinate on themselves, and also stimulates ejaculation in a male. Now, on the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your resting and digesting part of your body, contracts your pupil, so it's not as much of an issue to have light in, and because it's your resting and digesting, digestion becomes much more important. So it stimulates salivation, which is drooling, basically. It's going to stimulate your digestive activity. Basically, everything's going to slow down. Your blood pressure is going to go down, heart rate's going to go down. It's going to stimulate your gallbladder, which is an important part of digestion, helps break down fats, that kind of thing, or produces bile that breaks down fats. Contracts the bladder, allows blood flow. So you can see how both of these are necessary. Now, I'm sure you've had an experience where maybe you weren't sure, is somebody following me? What's going on? Or you were almost in a car accident, or maybe there was a tornado warning and you were afraid that you were going to have some kind of weather-based event. You know what it feels like to have this fight or flight system kick in. But try to imagine with me what it would feel like to be in that place all the time, to have your heart always racing, to have your blood pressure always high, to have your body always preparing to run or to fight. That's what it feels like to have a stress disorder. Now you can imagine that this could have a negative impact on a person's physical health as well, because we need those periods of resting and digesting. So acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder basically have the same symptoms. The difference is going to be the timing. So something that's acute, if we're not talking about geometry, but we're talking about the time period here, it's acute. It's happening right afterwards. So the symptoms begin within 4 weeks of the event, and they last for less than 1 month. So this is a person who experiences a stressful situation and then has some lingering effects for up to a month. Now, one of the reasons why it can be tricky trying to diagnose and work with a client who has a stress disorder is that it's hard to define exactly what is an appropriate response and what is an excessive response to a trauma. There's no handbook on this, on how a person should respond to having some kind of personal trauma. So we go back, though, to our D's that we talked about, right? Deviance. That's a little harder because, as I said, we don't necessarily have social norms for what it looks like to be traumatized. But Distress, so is the person continuing to experience distress? Dysfunction, is this keeping the person from functioning in his or her daily life? Those kinds of things can help us try to identify whether or not there's actually a disorder here. But bear in mind that a person who has gone through a trauma, you would expect that they would have some issues for a certain period of time. So if the issues resolve after a month, then we would say this person had acute stress disorder and it resolved itself. On the other hand, individuals may develop post-traumatic stress disorder. With PTSD, the symptoms may begin shortly after the event, but there are times when an individual seems to maybe handle the trauma well, and then the negative effects actually pop up later on. Maybe there's something that reminds the person of the trauma, or a different stressor that causes the person to start to have symptoms. Now, it says as many as 80% of all cases of acute stress disorder develop into PTSD. So if we start off with acute stress disorder, symptoms begin right away, and then they never really dissipate after a month, then we would say that that has become PTSD now. So basically we're seeing very similar symptoms, we're just seeing different time periods. So what do some of these symptoms look like? Well, first of all, in order to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, the person has to be exposed to a traumatic event, which, as I said, makes this a little bit different from other anxiety disorders. Now, what actually meets criteria for a traumatic event? One of the things that you're looking for here would be a threat to the person's health and well-being, a threat to the person's life. So it lists here death, threatened death, severe injury, sexual violation. This could also be in another person. So if someone that you deeply care about had maybe a threatened death situation or some kind of trauma, that can also cause PTSD in a loved one. Or if you witness this happening to another person, even if it's not a person that you were close with, it could be a stranger, but actually witnessing this in someone very, like temporally, like right there while you were there witnessing this, can cause PTSD as well. Now, in addition to the exposure to the traumatic event, the person starts to have symptoms. And so there are a few listed here: repeated, uncontrolled, distressing memories, trauma-linked dreams. Dissociative experiences would kind of be where a person loses time a little bit or loses contact with reality. Maybe they're not exactly sure where they are. So that could be like a flashback. Significant upset when exposed to trauma-linked cues. So if there's a noise or a smell or something that reminds a person of a trauma, then that can also trigger a lot of negative emotions, as you can imagine. And then pronounced physical reactions, so the person might start to have some of those fight or flight symptoms, that increased blood pressure, hyperventilation, that kind of thing. Now, as you would understand, this person would be likely to try to avoid anything that reminds them of the trauma. So this could be avoiding certain people, this could be avoiding certain locations, or maybe even avoiding a place where a person has previously had a flashback, that kind of thing. So in a way, this is a little bit similar, could be a little bit similar to that agoraphobia we talked about in the anxiety disorders lecture. Also, we're going to see changes in cognition and mood. So the person may think differently, may have different mood patterns afterwards, maybe have some memory loss, repeated negative emotions. So what we're going to see here when we talk about treatment is we're going to often try to change, especially these trauma-linked cognitions. The way that a person thinks about the event is going to be something we're going to work on in treatment. Now, the person may display changes in arousal and reactivity. So what you may see is that a person is, because they're constantly living in that fight or flight place, a person may kind of over-respond if there's a loud noise or if there's something that kind of triggers some of these symptoms. And so you may see people who feel like they can't relax, they can't shut their brain down, so then sleep issues can be a problem. Insomnia could be a problem, especially if a person is having dreams related to the trauma. And then, as we said, for it to be post-traumatic stress disorder, the symptoms have to last longer than a month. If we're seeing these symptoms in someone and they last less than a month, we would call that acute stress disorder. All right, so as I said, the onset and the duration are the main differences. So acute stress disorder always has that early onset and has a duration of less than a month. PTSD could have an early onset or it could have a later onset, but the symptoms last longer. But some of the core symptoms that people often mention, re-experiencing the traumatic event in some way, which could be those flashbacks, memories, that kind of thing, avoidance of anything that reminds them of the trauma. Reduced responsiveness could have to do with social things. So a person who has been through a trauma may intentionally start to isolate, maybe not comfortable being around other people or not comfortable being in public situations, as well as increased arousal. So that's the kind of the sympathetic nervous system we talked about, feeling anxiety and feeling guilt. So what we unfortunately see is that sometimes people who have been the victim of a trauma, for whatever reason, start to feel guilty about the event as if they were supposed to have seen it coming or prevented it, or maybe wondering if they could have done something different. And so that can kind of contribute to this negative cycle and make these symptoms worse. So what triggers acute and post-traumatic stress? Well, what we see is that it can occur at any age. Now, this is difficult. We understand that it can happen in children, that children who have been traumatized can experience post-traumatic stress disorder. At least 3.5% of all people in the U.S. are affected each year. Once again, with all these numbers, the true number could be a little bit higher. I'm sure there are some cases that we don't know about, but roughly 3.5%. It says around 2/3 of those individuals seek treatment at some point. That's a pretty high number. So when we're thinking about who seeks treatment, there are several different things to consider. One thing might be people are more likely to seek treatment if the symptoms are causing more dysfunction. So if a person's life is, greatly impacted, they might be more likely to seek help. Also, if the symptoms are obvious to another person, then that could potentially cause the person to seek help more because maybe they have pressure from people in their lives that I see you're struggling, let's get you into help, which is not, I say pressure, but that's not a negative thing. I would encourage individuals who need treatment to seek treatment. Whether or not a person seeks treatment also has to do with the accessibility of the treatment. Can you afford the treatment? There are several different things that play a role there, but 2/3 is a pretty high percentage of people who are seeking treatment. We usually see much lower numbers, and so I think that reflects the severe nature of post-traumatic stress. Now, the ratio of women to men is 2-1. So this is true, as I said previously, of all the internalizing disorders. Women are more likely to be diagnosed, and that could be because women have the symptoms more often, or it could just be that women may be more likely to seek treatment for these kinds of things. And it may be with this particular situation, it may be that women are a little bit more likely to be the victim of certain kinds of crimes and situations like that. And so that could be why that ratio is higher as well. It says people with low incomes are twice as likely as people with higher incomes to be diagnosed with a stress disorder. So several things to think about there. If a person is living in an unsafe situation, maybe because of poverty, neighborhood, that kind of thing, then that increases the likelihood they would be exposed to a trauma. But also it may be that because, think back to our definition of stress, about how you have the stressful events and the stress response. It could be that individuals who are living in poverty just have more stressful events happening at one time, which could make these symptoms more severe. And there are certain events that are more likely to cause this disorder: combat, disasters, abuse, victimization. These are not the only events that can cause PTSD, but they're some of the ones that we see most often. I think probably the thing that comes to mind when people mention PTSD is probably combat situations, and certainly that can happen. However, civilian traumas are much more likely to result in stress disorders. Now, that's probably because there are more civilian traumas, just as far as like percentages and numbers go. But there may also be a stigma against seeking help when it comes to, combat situations. Maybe we're not doing a good job with things like VAs and our healthcare system for our veterans. And so that could be something to consider as well. Natural and accidental disasters, so things like earthquakes, floods, tornadoes, fires. So what you may see is that when a particular area has been impacted, then that can greatly impact all of the people in that area. So if you're thinking about things like hurricanes that come through, there may be like epidemics of post-traumatic stress disorder because there's so many people exposed to life-threatening harm there. It also lists things like airplane crashes, serious car accidents. So there are several different situations that could potentially lead to a person developing post-traumatic stress symptoms, not just combat situations. In addition to combat situations, probably something else that comes to mind would be like being the victim of a crime of some sort. So research suggests that more than 1/3 of all victims of physical or sexual assault develop PTSD. Now, what I want to say here is that it is challenging to work with a client who has been a victim of something like this, because oftentimes as a clinician, you want to have all the answers. You want to be the person that makes it better. And yet, you don't always have answers for why things like this happen. What I do want to say is that it's unfortunate that sometimes in our culture, we tend to blame the victim. And I don't want to camp out here too long. It's not as much related to abnormal psychology, but we do this where an individual is abused or traumatized, and we say, okay, well, it was something about the person that caused that trauma. That is wrong. A, it's wrong, and B, it's dangerous, because you take the blame from where it belongs, which is on the perpetrator, and put it on the victim, and that's never okay to do that. The reason why that happens, though, if you study social psychology, is that people tend to be very bothered by their own vulnerability. And so if a person feels like they can label why this terrible thing happened to another person, they feel like they can prevent it from happening to themselves and happening to the people that they love. We don't like to accept the fact that we don't always have control over our outcomes. And that's all I will say there, but what I will say is that we need to try to dispel that way of thinking, because it makes the perpetrators more emboldened in what they do. And it makes the victims feel like they can't seek help. So what I want to tell you guys is that this is a serious situation that should never happen to anyone. Once it does happen, though, we do have treatments that can be effective. In addition to being abused or victimized, terrorism or torture, this is something that I think depends a great deal on the culture that a person is raised in. We don't have to face this in the United States as much as other cultures do. Of course, we do see, terrible events happening in our country sometimes, but for the most part, we wake up and we go about our day and we're not necessarily worried about having a terrorist attack. But in certain parts of the world, this is the everyday life for people. So you can imagine that being exposed to that kind of environment long term could potentially cause some pretty significant stress symptoms. All right, now, this is not a class specifically on legal ramifications, but something to keep in mind is that PTSD can sometimes be a factor in the commission of crimes. So, for example, an individual who commits a crime may have a defense, or at least I should say a person who's charged with a crime may have a defense related to mental health. And so this is one of the things that's tricky when you're doing something like an assessment. A person may be trying to get a certain kind of diagnosis because they feel like that would go well for them in a legal situation. If a person has PTSD, that individual might be more likely to have flashbacks, might be more likely to have some of those moments where they feel like they lose control, those dissociation moments there. So, how should juries and judges handle this? What comes to mind here, and it's been a long time, I haven't reviewed the details, but Oscar Pistorius was a Paralympian. I can't remember how long it's been ago, but he had an incident where he shot and killed his girlfriend in their apartment or in their house. And I can't remember the details, but the basic idea was his defense was that he had PTSD, he had been traumatized. I think they said he had generalized anxiety disorder as well, something like that. And so he woke up, he heard a noise, he thought someone had broken into the house, and he, according to his defense, he kind of overreacted here, and unfortunately, his girlfriend died after that incident. So it's very, very challenging to think of how you would handle that situation if you were on a jury. A person who committed a crime, a person who maybe admits that they committed a crime, but has a defense because of a pre-existing psychological condition. So some of the things to keep in mind there would be, okay, if a person has post-traumatic stress disorder, that's absolutely not that person's fault. So at what point how do we handle that situation? I don't have the right answer for that. Should this person be given more of a criminal sentence, or more of maybe we need some inpatient psychological treatment, or a combination of both? Obviously something that's complex and something to consider. Most of us will probably never find ourselves in a situation serving on a jury like that, but it certainly would be an interesting case. All right. Now, we know that there are many individuals who experience trauma who do not go on to develop a stress disorder. So when we're trying to do research on stress disorders, we want to understand why some people develop these symptoms and some people do not. The idea here goes back to our diathesis stress model. So the idea that a person has a predisposition, and then there is a stressful event, and then because of the predisposition combined with the stressful event, they have the symptoms. So when an individual is exposed to a stressful event, there are several different things that impact whether or not they go on to develop PTSD. But one of those things has to do with, did you already have a predisposition? Now, that predisposition could be genetic. We don't understand the genetics of PTSD very well, but it could be a genetic, so it could be neurotransmitters, that kind of thing. But also you could have a psychological predisposition to developing a stress disorder. So, for example, pre-existing high anxiety. So a person who already had an anxiety disorder before they were exposed to a traumatic event might be more likely to go on and develop PTSD. Also, a negative worldview, which is not always associated with depression, but is often associated with depression. You can see how if a person has a negative worldview and then a trauma occurs, it's like the trauma kind of concretes that negative worldview of, okay, the world is a bad place, it is scary, there is very little I can do to protect myself. That helplessness, hopelessness, feeling out of control. So if a person has some of those depressive thoughts beforehand, then they can maybe go on to develop PTSD after the trauma as well. On the other hand, there may be some factors here that make a person less likely to develop PTSD. So a protective factor here. A risk factor is something that would increase the likelihood of developing symptoms. A protective factor would be something that would decrease the likelihood of developing symptoms. So someone who has this resiliency. Now, resiliency is something that's a little bit hard to define, but it's a person who bounces back a little bit more easily. And there are several different things that go into that. One of those things would be social support. So your previous experiences and the experiences you're having right now in relationships impact your ability to respond well to stress. So first of all, talking about previous experiences, researchers have found a link between certain childhood experiences and then developing symptoms later on, especially after exposure to trauma. So, for example, an impoverished childhood. So a person who had lived in poverty as a child might have some biological predisposition here, maybe because of living in those very stressful situations, which impacts your hormones and impacts your health. Maybe it's because there's psychological disorders in the family. So being raised by parents who have psychological problems makes it less likely that a child would receive that authoritative parenting that we know is best. So authoritative parenting is a high level of structure, so we need discipline, but combined with a high level of affection as well, which is challenging for any parent to give all the time. But a parent who struggles with psychological health issues, it's harder for that parent to give that kind of parenting. So that may be an issue as well. Also, at an early age, experiencing assault, abuse, catastrophe, it is very difficult for children sometimes to understand. I mean, there are certain things that an adult can't understand, can't make sense of. And so you can imagine a child trying to make sense of that would be especially difficult. And this is just correlational, but being younger than 10 years when parents separated or divorced. I think it's unfortunate in our culture that divorce has been normalized because there are a lot of negative outcomes that are associated with divorce, both in the individuals who get divorced as well as any children that might be present from that relationship. So being younger when children are maybe struggling to make sense of parents being separated. So in addition to the psychological consequences there, also if parents separate, you may see the child may have to move, may have school-related issues, may have some poverty because typically in these cases the mother has the children, but then mothers or women don't earn as much money as men do, and so it may be hard for women to provide for children on their own, that kind of thing. So this is just correlational, but there's some of the risk factors associated with childhood experiences. And then as far as adult experiences go, having social support at the time of the trauma. So what we see is that people who are married tend to have better psychological outcomes and better physical outcomes. They tend to live longer and have healthier lives. And the thought is that having that support system helps a person to have that resiliency. Now, does that support system have to be a spouse? No, of course not. It could be a sibling, it could be a close friend or other family member, but you need someone you can talk to. Unfortunately, a person who has been traumatized as just kind of part of the symptoms may start to kind of isolate themselves. And so one thing that's important is to make sure that people are getting the help that they need and getting the social support that they need always, but especially after a traumatic event. All right, so having a predisposition is important, trying to determine whether a person will develop symptoms or not. But also the severity of the trauma. So the more severe the trauma and the more direct one's exposure to it, the greater the likelihood of developing a stress disorder. This makes sense. Now when it talks about the more direct one's exposure to it, so a trauma that occurs to you is more likely to trigger post-traumatic stress disorder than a trauma that you see in someone else. But then if you're watching the trauma in someone else and it's happening right in front of you, then that's more likely than if it's happening and you don't have as much direct exposure to it. Having someone very close to you go through a traumatic experience is more likely than someone who maybe you know kind of generally but don't know very well. So the closer you are to the trauma and the more severe the trauma. Of course, sometimes it's a little bit hard to quantify what makes a trauma more or less severe. Some of the things that seem to be especially risky: mutilation, severe injury, or witnessing the injury or the death of another person. These are some of the things that make a person most likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder. So you can see why the riskiest situations are the riskiest situations. So you can see how something like this could happen in combat. You can see how something like this could happen with something like a natural disaster, for example. So the types of traumas that are most likely to cause post-traumatic stress disorder are more severe and more directly exposed to the individual. Now, what happens when an individual has post-traumatic stress? Well, about half of all cases improve within 6 months. They may improve on their own, especially if the person is not being, traumatized repetitively. Maybe if they're out of that situation in which the trauma occurred, then symptoms could get better on their own. Or it may be a situation where a person really needs some kind of treatment. Now, the treatment goals are going to be to end those stress reactions. So we're going to try to reduce the symptoms. We're going to try to change the way the person thinks about the trauma, and we're going to try to return them to a level of functioning. Now, when we're talking about helping a person gain perspective on painful experiences, what we would like to do is to undo this. But you can't. That's the thing. When you have a client who's gone through something like this, you cannot undo it for them. you have to help them come to terms with it. And that means sometimes you, as the clinician, have to come to terms with it yourself. It's very difficult. Having worked with clients who have had traumatic experiences, it's very, very challenging for both the client and the clinician. And it's really important that you develop a good rapport, a good relationship with your client so they feel comfortable coming to you for this kind of treatment. We want to help them understand that although the event did happen, that it was not their fault, and we want to help them to have hope for the future. So there may be some lingering cognitions or thought processes they have about the event that are maybe making those symptoms persist or making the symptoms worse. We want to try to help to reduce those. Now, how do we actually do this? Well, the treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, there are several potential treatments. The treatment that has received the most research support has been exposure therapy, which we touched on this a little bit in the anxiety disorders lecture. So we talked about how if a person has a phobia, we expose them to the thing that they're afraid of. If a person has social anxiety, we expose them to social situations. If a person has OCD, we expose them to something that triggers their obsessions. This sounds very cruel, but the basic idea is that a person who has anxiety is very often avoiding something. And avoiding something then kind of perpetuates these symptoms. They never go away because you're constantly afraid. If I come in contact with the thing I'm afraid of, what will happen? So it's always in the back of your mind. So exposure-based therapy is very challenging for both the client and the clinician. But the idea is you need to help the person feel comfortable with you first. You need to develop a rapport, and you need to get the client's consent before you do this. But exposure therapy often involves having the client talk to you in detail, at length, about the traumatic experience. One of the things that people do sometimes is at the beginning of treatment have the client write down their story. And they write down in detail what happened. How did you feel about it? What do you think about this event? Have them write it out in detail. Now, you can imagine that for a person who's been through this trauma, that is a very difficult thing. But it provides you a starting point in therapy. And so then you help the person walk through it until they're not afraid of it anymore, until they don't feel the need to avoid it anymore. And along the way, as you expose them to it, you start helping the person see it a little bit differently. So that when they say something like, I should have known, I should have seen that, you say, no, there was no way for you to know there. And you try to pick up on those cues where the client is blaming his or herself, where they are feeling guilty about something, or where they're feeling helpless or hopeless. You try to pick up on that and help them see that there is hope for the future. So you cannot change, this is what I tell clients, you cannot change the event. The event was terrible, and it should have never happened to you, and you don't deserve it. However, it was significant. It was a significant event in your life, and therefore, because of that, the treatment's going to have to be something significant too. The treatment's going to be hard too, but the outcome is that you don't have to be afraid of the event anymore, and you don't have to feel guilty about it or feel like it's your fault anymore and try to change the way that people think about it. Now, also, thinking about how we treated phobias, you may teach progressive muscle relaxation, you may teach deep breathing, and have people practice that while they're doing the exposure. Now, there may be some situations where you're not able to expose the client. So, for example, what happens if a client is traumatized because of an event that took place in combat? We can't take the client back to that location and walk through it with them. But virtual reality, as we talked about in the anxiety disorders lecture, virtual reality may allow for people to, at least in some ways, re-experience the event while you're there with them, helping them breathe, helping them stay calm, trying to guide the way they're thinking about the situation. So these treatments are effective, but they're hard. So if there's anything we can do to try to reduce distress from the very beginning, if there's anything we can do to try to help a person not develop PTSD, then we would like to do that. So psychological debriefing is something that can be done immediately after a trauma. So kind of the thing that comes to mind would be a soldier right after combat, right after maybe when they're just being, returning home. or if possible, like immediately after the incident happened, have them sit down and talk with someone at that point. Because if a person continues to suffer for months and months at a time before they seek treatment, the problems may get worse. If we can catch it early and try to help them beforehand, and at the very least get them in contact with a psychologist if they need more than this. But having them come in and talk about their reactions, talk about what happened, making sure that you normalize their response. So whatever that response is, there's no right way to respond to a trauma. So normalize that. If the client is anxious, if the client is angry, if the client is frustrated, understand that and encourage them to express that to you, because you don't want them to feel like they have to put on a certain face or as if they're supposed to respond a certain way. There's no handbook for this. Teach them skills that can be helpful for them. So knowing that a person who has been through a trauma is at an increased risk for things like avoidance, for things like flashbacks, things like having these negative dreams. There are certain behavioral things you can do that are helpful with that. And we do have a treatment for nightmare disorder, so we can treat nightmares as well. Helping the client, maybe just learning some of those relaxation techniques here can be helpful and maybe prevent some of these symptoms from coming up later. And then providing referrals. So if the client says, okay, I think I'm okay, you need to give them some information about when you might have some red flags. If you start to see some symptoms, if you start to feel some distress, this is who you can contact. This is how you can get help, making sure that they know that help is available and they know how to access that help if and when they need it. All right. So your activity for this lecture video has to do with identifying the unique difficulties involved in treating an individual with PTSD. So think about yourself as the psychologist working with a client who has been traumatized. There are any number of potential reasons why this is difficult for a clinician. I just listed a few that came to mind when I was making these slides. Ethics of exposure. Exposure is the best therapy we have for PTSD. It helps people get better, but at the same time, it's really hard for the client to be exposed to the trauma again, to be thinking about it, to be changing. I told you guys I had them write down their experience, but then I forgot to mention that at the end of therapy, have them write it down again and see if it's changed, see if the way they think about the issue has changed. But exposing someone to a traumatic event over and over again is obviously going to be really stressful for the client and stressful for the clinician. Imagine having to listen to some of the traumatic experiences and to feel maybe like you're vulnerable now too, hearing these traumatic events. Also, one thing that's really hard is that if you have a client sitting across from you with post-traumatic stress disorder, they have experienced something that they never should have had to experience. They have experienced a significant trauma. Now, if we label this as post-traumatic stress disorder, is that us telling the client that they're not responding the right way? Is that us telling the client that they are in the wrong in the way they're overreacting to a significant trauma? Of course, that's not the way I would put it at all. I think that it's very common for this to happen, but imagine what it would feel like as the clinician telling your client, you need to change the way that you think about this event. Do you have the right to do so? I want you guys to be thinking critically about the difficulties that come along with treating individuals who have post-traumatic stress disorder. So let me know if you have any questions. That's all the information for this lecture video. Make sure that you complete Activity 6. Make sure that it is at least 200 words long. And I will talk to you guys in the next lecture video.